Movements in the 60s by Parker C., Leonard Cooper, and Zoe Corwin. The 1960s showed the world a period of new ideas and new revolutions in many aspects of American society. The younger generation of American people became very active in trying to influence the governmental order of the post-World War II society to move in a more equal direction than generations before. The leaders of these movements helped to persuade the government to act, but in some cases most of the credit should be given to the government for the movement's success. While the civil rights movement showed the effectiveness of movement leaders in causing change, both the anti-war movement and the environmental movement gave rise to mainly government action, causing the success of the movement. During the 1960s, the people of the U.S. showed a great increase in support for civil rights. There were great groups and leaders that headed the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King Jr., who is famous for his I Have a Dream speech and his letters from Birmingham jail. Malcolm X was also a big leader who is famous for encouraging not just equal rights but black supremacy and becoming more in touch with African roots. It started off with the freedom rides organized by the SCLC and CORE, which included many students and movement leaders such as Stokely Carmichael, riding buses into the segregated southern bus stations. Document B explains the idea behind the freedom rides and how they stayed in the jails to receive more public attention and make it too expensive to keep them all. Due to the violence initiated by the opposition of the rides, as well as movement leaders pressuring the government, the Supreme Court ruled that all public travel facilities could not be segregated in the case of Bailey v. Patterson. In addition, movement leaders as well as other participants sent direct pressure to the segregated private businesses by sitting in and preventing the daily business for those companies. As it shows in Document A, it was a very effective form of protest because the protesters weren't doing enough to cause violence, and they even had the support of many of the residents. The most well-known of these was the Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina, that once the owners finally gave in to the pressure of the students led to the integration of many other private businesses to prevent sit-ins from occurring to them. These were peaceful protests that received much attention through television, which helped with winning the sympathy of the people. The government responded to this by passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The summer after is known as Freedom Summer, in which many groups organized protests, mainly in the Mississippi, to raise awareness of the resistance that was happening against black voting. This protest, which resulted in 3 deaths, forced President LBJ to look closer into the problem and use federal intervention to stop the discrimination that was going on in Selma, Montgomery, and other cities. He called on Congress to pass a voting rights bill, and in 1965 the Voting Rights Act was created. All of these major pieces of legislation wouldn't have or would have taken much longer to happen if Congress hadn't been spurred by the groups and organizations that let their opinions be known. Albeit many presidents encouraged this movement, like Kennedy when he spoke on civil rights in 1963 and when LBJ passed the Civil and Voting Rights Act. But the government reacted to what the people wanted. Kennedy and Johnson saw that the civil rights was what the people wanted, so they gave it to them. It was the people who made the civil rights movement the success that it was. The environmental movement was one of the few great success stories for the United States government in the 1960s. The people of the United States were not entirely excited nor trusting of their government at the time, mainly due to the progression of Vietnam War and the Cold War. However, the environment offered somewhat of a sanctuary for the government to regain some of the lost popularity with the average citizen. So many of these citizens took action. For example, Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, became one of the most influential books at its time due to its extensive research on the chemical pesticide DDT and its harmful effects on the humans and wildlife. Up until that point, the chemical was considered entirely harmless and one of the greatest things to happen to agriculture. This book sparked a fire that eventually found its way up to the Oval Office in Congress. While the public outrage did add to the banning of DDT in 1970, the actions taken by Congress and its environmental committees are what really brought about the biggest effects to the banning of many harmful chemicals, having to fight many farming committees and unions. Another example of the major impact of the government on the environment is the Water Quality Act of 1965 and the Clean Air Act of 1967. While both of these acts had some contribution from the public, the congressional activity was the greatest overall in helping to set the standards for healthier living and healthier environment that these acts created. Both of these applied funding to the state's enforcement of environmental standards. While this was not necessarily direct action by federal government, it did show that Washington was concerned about the people's health as well as the environment. While there was major contributions towards America's more natural side by organizations such as Sierra Club and the World Wildlife Fund, as well as people such as Jacques Cousteau, the biggest changes came from the United States government. During the 1960s, the successes of anti-war protests by citizens were few and far between. Furthermore, the U.S. government was most responsible for the accomplishments of the goals of the people's protests. During the years of JFK's presidency, the U.S. government was deciding whether or not to enter Vietnam. Conservatives believed firmly in invading Vietnam and the idea of communist containment, but JFK and his supporters didn't want to cause another global crisis, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis that momentarily put the U.S. on edge of nuclear war. After the 1963 assassination of JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson's promotion to presidency, however, the U.S. was swayed to allow Johnson to enter Vietnam, as is evidenced in Document E, the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed LBJ to put troops in Vietnam without Congress's approval. Many citizens were upset about this, specifically the New Left or counterculture comprised of young liberals who held scores of marches and peaceful protests. These hippies preached universal messages of world peace and unity that were viewed as borderline socialist or communist by staunch conservatives who actually made up most of the country. From 1964 to 1968, anti-war protesters held quite a few events, such as the 1964 New York marches from Times Square to the UN building, and the 1967 Fifth Avenue Peace Parade, led by a former soldier. They were also angry about the fact that the U.S. government instituted a draft, as is evidenced by the statements of dissatisfaction in Document I, and held protests about it. One of these protests evolved into a landmark Supreme Court case, U.S. versus O'Brien, 1968. These protests drew the sympathy and attention of people in the U.S., but the LBJ administration hardly acted because of these demonstrations. In fact, President Johnson used the strategy attrition, literally bombing enemy over and over into submission, to try to end the war. He was trying to end the war in which the protesters wanted, but for obviously vastly different reasons. By 1968, the power of anti-war protesters had declined, and it took some fatal blows by the end of the year. First of all, the Viet Cong Tet Offensive incited shock into Americans and caused government leaders to push even harder in the war. Also, 1968 was the election year, and the liberal opponents of the war had a strong candidate for the presidency in Robert F. Kennedy. He probably would have won the election and tried to stop the war quickly, but he was shot and killed by a Palestinian extremist. Consequently, Richard Nixon won the presidency by a narrow margin because George Wallace split the Democrat ticket, and instituted the idea of peace with honor, which meant he wouldn't withdraw from Vietnam anytime soon. Martin Luther King Jr., a proponent of the anti-war movement, was also killed that year. These events essentially mollified the power of the counterculture. Nixon later implemented Vietnamization, the strategy of gradually pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam and allowing the South Vietnamese to fight their own war. This idea was born from Nixon's mind and wasn't significantly influenced by any anti-war movements. It was really just the next phase in his plan for peace with honor. The North Vietnamese gained ground in the South over the next few years until the culmination of the war in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and North Vietnamese victory. In conclusion, the few goals of the anti-war movement that were actually achieved in the 1960s, for example, pulling troops out of Vietnam, were achieved solely because of the U.S. government desired so and were not significantly influenced by the actual movement or movement leaders of the era.